Noriega was such a close asset for the US for so long, for like decades, that, he undeniably knew secrets. He knew a lot of things that he shouldn't know. All of the CIA directors that passed through his time, we're talking like Richard Helms in the early 1970s, who he was super close with. That's like the CIA director under Nixon, Watergate, like really big guy. But the big one was like George H.W. Bush. Like those two really butted heads. And then H.W. becomes VP to Reagan in the 1980s. And it's sort of like their responsibility to communicate with Noriega.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Crime and Entertainment. Got a very interesting guest here, Mr. Cillian Dunne. How you doing, my friend?
Good, man. Thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you for tracking me down. You tracked me down through email and sent me kind of a plot outline of a book that you were writing, or about you're finished writing, right? It's finished?
I am, yeah. It's called The Right-Hand Man. It's out on November 4th, and the website is www.therighthandmanbook.com if you want to check out any early stuff.
And I'll be honest with you, and I looked at some of the stuff that was on there too. A couple of them I'll probably ask you about, but I don't have time when doing this podcast, and I have a regular job. You very much have time for books reading, unless it's on Audible. But when you told me a little bit of the subject matter, I was like, well, this is one I'm going to have to check out one way or another, because it involves someone that's been trained by the CIA, that was the right-hand man to Noriega. I mean, just all sorts of interesting things. So let's get right into this book, man. First off, how did you come across the subject matter to write this?
Yeah. So I mean, picture this. I was 27. I didn't have a job. I had actually quit my job to write my fourth book. It was called Dreams in Incarceration. It's a nonfiction account of Bloods and Crips in California State Prison. So I did a lot of on the ground research, interviewing people, things like that. I didn't have time for work or a 9 to 5. So I was broke ass poor. Like I really had no money to my name. I held a book signing in Los Angeles, and my buddy on Instagram, who lives in Panama, saw it. He calls me up and he says, "Hey, my business partner is a Panamanian guy who has access to this really cool story. If you're familiar with the Iran-Contra affair." I kind of was. I'd seen this movie, American Made, like Tom Cruise movie. It's cool, but that's sort of like the time period it covers. So right. I said, yeah, hell yeah. Like I'm in the market for another book. I get on the phone with Jose Goldner. He's he's the guy who put all the pieces together down here. And he basically tells me the story in like 20, 30 minutes, like the Cliff Notes version. And I was hooked. But then he said, when can you come to Panama? He's like, if you can be here tomorrow, hop on a plane. So I pretty much did just that. I was in Panama like a few days later. I barely speak Spanish. I'd never been to Central America. I show up at Jose's apartment, and he says, "Okay, get a good night's rest. Tomorrow we're meeting Carlos Wickreen. He was the right-hand man to Noriega. Like it's his story that's going to be the foundation of this book." So yeah, dude. I mean, I went to bed that night. I didn't sleep at all. I was terrified. I get up in the morning, we go to meet him for sort of like brunch at this Italian restaurant, and they're speaking in Spanish, and then a little bit of Spanglish. There's some English thrown in, and then Carlos and I just sort of joked around, and at the end of the lunch, he sort of turns to me and he's like, "Yeah, you'll do a good job." So then we made plans over the next few days, and then we hitched out to rural Panama for like a month. The first little stretch was like a month. And we were out there for like 3 to 4 weeks until these civil protests started, and I had to fly back to the US. The US embassy was telling people to get out of Panama, and then because of that, I would have done it all in one go if not for that, but I had to continue to return over the course of like 2 years to write the book in total. So that's sort of how it all started.
Okay. So tell us about Carlos. Like you're meeting this individual, you're hearing this story for the first time? How did he, or whoever I don't know if he told you a little bit about it beforehand, or did you kind of figure out the meat and potatoes of this from Carlos himself?
I was pretty much a blank slate. I had about as much time to research it as like I gave you from when we first spoke to right now. So I mean, you were like, I was in your shoes, you were in my shoes. I could get a little bit of it, but I had so many questions. I
Yeah.
was like riddled with questions. So I called myself like I was like a blank piece of paper going in, and I think that was the best possible way to do it because I had no bias or prejudice.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Okay. So what did they break this off? Like, how does somebody get involved with everything that he was involved with? Because to be in cahoots with all these people, be trained by the CIA, the Mossad, working with Noriega, how does that start?
So Carlos's sister married Noriega, right? And but they met when Carlos was like a teenager, when he was like 7 or 18, and it was at a family party. And Noriega was there in a suit with all of his honors because he was a little bit older. He was like nearly a decade older, and he'd already been very impressive. He had a very impressive military background before he met Carlos. And he basically just liked him. You know, he was also, you know, trying to get in with the family and you know, have a good impression to my knowledge. But he saw Carlos as somebody who was strong, loyal, and at the end of the day, like a great fighter. You know, Carlos was a boxer. He loved like weapons. You know, he owned knives and guns at a young age. Like, you know, he was one of those kind of guys. So Noriega took him under his wing, and Carlos sort of stayed under that wing for a very long time until a coup erupted in Panama in 1968 and 1969. But by the end of 1969, the sort of dictatorship under Omar Torrijos
Hmm.
started, and Manuel Noriega became Torrijos' chief of intelligence.
Right.
So Carlos, by the early 1970s, was, you know, he was like the apprentice for the number one spy in Panama, who had all of the direct correspondence with the CIA, with the DEA was new at that stage in the early 70s. It you know, it was only created around that time. Um, when it came to Mossad, Carlos was approached and asked to sort of go to Israel and do training. He was out there for like anywhere between 2 and 3 years. He didn't give me an exact amount of time. There was a lot that he couldn't say. But he sort of recounted stories to me about what his training was like, and he sort of spoke about the sort of the global stage of world intelligence at that time was very different than what it ultimately ended up becoming towards the end of the book, because in the early 1970s, the number one sort of threat to the US government was communism, was the spread of communism. So it was very much like Russian spies, American spies, and you know, each side sort of wanted to have like the best of the best, of course, and they wanted access to the most intelligence. So Carlos, being a Panamanian, was strategic for the US because Central America was at this point, you know, Panama especially was pro USA. Nicaragua had a pro American government. You know, they held a lot of power. Not many people said no to them down there. So Carlos had a lot of opportunities. That's how he was, you know, brought to Israel. That's why he was brought to Washington to be trained by the DEA, because he just like was so close to Noriega. He had sort of proven himself in Panama. And then the CIA, I would say he did the least amount for, but the work that he did do mostly came in the 80s when the like civil war in Nicaragua started between the Sandinistas and the Contras, which ultimately led to the Iran-Contra affair.
Right. Now, what was he doing for the CIA specifically?
You know, it was mostly just like passing intelligence. So,
Okay.
you know, intelligence is a business, right?
Right.
Everybody's, you know, if you want intelligence, like you got to pay for it. So they trade, you know, there are a lot of stories about like, you know, bags of cash being handed over to Noriega and, you know, other certain Panamanians. But to my knowledge, it all filtered through Noriega, right? So Carlos was like the right-hand man to Noriega. If Noriega was tasked with something, it was often passed down to Carlos. For instance, a lot of the drug trade that was rising in the 1970s went through the Panama Canal. So not all of it, but a lot of it did. So there's a thing like on the other side of Panama City, on the other side of the country, there's a city called Colón. Colón had like a really bad sort of drug transportation problem. So if intelligence was asked of Carlos, it was usually to do with something like that, or it was to do with Cuba. He was essentially great friends with Fidel Castro, and he, not to call him like a triple spy, but he played every role that was needed of him, and Castro knew about that. So Castro knew that Carlos was an asset for the CIA and DEA, but he would like filter intelligence through him. So if the DEA was like, Carlos, we need to know about drug trades running from like Havana to Miami. Like, tell us exactly who's sort of like running these schemes, like, what direction they're going in, like basically whatever they could do to help like capture these guys, or to have intelligence on them at least. They would get Carlos to go to Cuba and essentially get that information from Castro. In return, information, and I don't really know like anything exact because he hid it from me. He didn't tell me the truth with everything, but they would pass information back and forth between each other. So because there were like 700 plus attempts on Castro's life by like the 1980s or something like that.
Oh yeah, there was a lot, man. I mean, the mob
Yeah.
allegedly even worked with the DEA or CIA to take him out. Sam Giancana specifically was
really?
to a hotel room and broke in there to try to get him. And he cost them boys a lot of money,
Yeah.
Meyer Lansky, they had casinos set up over there. And when he went over there and essentially just, took them over, and it cost them a lot of money. If you believe certain things that's written about Meyer Lansky, which was one of the founding members of La Cosa Nostra in New York, he lost the bulk of his fortune over there.
Wow.
He had sunk a lot of it into this hotel and casino operation, and they just took it. So they were very pissed at what Castro was doing, for sure.
Interesting. Yeah. And this, I can't say I know too much about that because all of this happens post-revolution.
Right.
But Castro was like, he, not to say he was like a god to these guys, but like he was highly regarded. And what these Latin leaders, especially the socialists and the left-leaning leaders, what they thought of Castro was like, this is the only guy to take on the United States and win. Right. That's how they saw it. Right. Because he wasn't like ousted from his throne like so many others, like Noriega was, even though he wasn't like a lefty. But like it was the ideology that a lot of people like really looked up to. But when it came to Carlos, like it was mostly just business and him just like really sort of like being influenced by that power that Castro held over so many people.
What are was he in? So it sounds like you said, he's definitely being called in for more information, but was there ever anything to where, like, because you would think if the government wants to take Castro out, would they maybe court him to try to put that into play, or was he strictly just going to be an information guy and not cross that line?
Strictly an information guy. There's a really good quote. I put it in my book, but I can't say I came up with it. But during the Castro years, this is a true statement, but there wasn't a single plane that landed in Cuba that Castro didn't know about. So everyone coming in and out of like the intelligence network in Cuba was so strong that the US placed so many spies on home soil in Cuba, and like none of them could get close to Castro. Like there's a reason why he survived so many assassination attempts, and he had a distrust of a lot of people, of course. Like how could you trust people like that? But most of it, of course, is generated by fear. Like he didn't really let that many people close to him because like anybody can be coerced. Like there's also another statement I heard. It was some guy here in Panama was talking about this, because in the book there's a chapter about there being $1 million bounty on Noriega's head that nobody knows where it came from. There's conspiracies that the CIA set it up, but nobody knows where it came from. And Noriega, the quote is that Noriega was like, of course someone's going to do this. Like any man with a cock and balls is going to shoot another man for $1 million. You know what I mean? What makes me any different? So that's fear. You know what I mean? It's distrust, but it's fear. So things were pretty closed. Like doors were closed in Cuba for a lot of people. Carlos became good friends with Castro. They hung out in closed circles, but Carlos was just like the most unbelievably loyal person. Like when I say through thick and thin, like we're talking about like the invasion of Panama where like shitloads of people died. Like this guy, if he if he went out swinging, like if he went out like Tony Montana, Scarface style, like he would have been just fine with it. You know what I mean? If that was his legacy, like he was deathly loyal to Noriega and sort of everything that they did together.
What was his role in the invasion of Panama? Just out of curiosity.
He so it's a little bit of a spoiler in the book because the invasion of Panama is it would be considered like a climax in any story, right, especially to do with Noriega. It's pretty tragic. Carlos's son had this like motorcycle accident he was in like a foreign school in Switzerland, and like 3 days before the invasion, Carlos had to go to the hospital in Switzerland. And then the invasion broke out while he was gone, and he scrambled his way to try to get back to Panama. So he like hitchhiked through Europe, like through France, like down into Spain. And because Interpol were on his trail as well, like he was wanted by the global police for crimes he had committed like a decade before in Spain, I believe. So he gets trapped in Spain, and then he has to watch on the news as his best friend in the world, Noriega, was being taken away after the U.S. invasion of Panama. So from like his perspective, highly emotional event. Lots of people he knew died, were killed in the invasion. But then also from like a historian's perspective, it's interesting because like the sort of the chain of events that start when Noriega becomes the dictator, de facto leader in 1983 to the invasion, it's very much like a boiling pot of water that is going to explode like at any second. You know what I mean? It just so happened that Carlos was away when the actual fighting took place, and no matter how hard he tried to get back, like he just could not get back.
Wow.
Yeah.
What was some of the big, I mean, obviously I know he took drug money and some other things. What were some of the biggest things that Noriega was involved in over there?
It's hard, it's hard to say. And I spent a long time trying to get to sort of the truth of that. I could say that what the U.S. government, he was indicted, which means like he was accused of, right. He was accused of money laundering, racketeering, and drug smuggling. Now, when they had his trial in Miami, they brought a lot of like testimony, like witnesses, and they gave their testimonies of, Noriega taking money to allow like drug smuggling to pass through Panama and like all that sort of stuff. I think it would be pretty naive to think that like he didn't benefit from the drug trade that was booming in Colombia at that time. You know what I mean? He was even friends with Pablo Escobar. You know what I mean? Like he wasn't great friends with him, but when Escobar needed refuge in 1984 after shooting a politician, I forget what the guy's name was. Noriega gave him refuge in Panama. You know what I mean? And that was 1984. So this stuff happens in 1989, the invasion. So within that few years, who's to say what happened? But it's difficult to make these claims like unbiasedly, like without prejudice, because a couple of the testimonies, the guys like a few years later admitted to being like sort of coerced into making the statements that they made. There wasn't a whole lot of evidence that tied them to drug smuggling and all this sort of stuff. And then on top of that, Noriega was such a close asset for the US for so long, for like decades, that he undeniably knew secrets. He knew a lot of things that he shouldn't know. All of the CIA directors that passed through his time, we're talking like Richard Helms in the early 1970s, who he was super close with. That's like the CIA director under Nixon, Watergate, like really big guy. But the big one was like George H.W. Bush. Like those two really butted heads. And then H.W. becomes VP to Reagan in the 1980s. And it's sort of like their responsibility to communicate with Noriega in a lot of, not directly, but inadvertently. And Noriega's ego was so big, and he pissed off Bush so much that, Bush sort of, he didn't like the guy at all. I believe that they had like some personal vendettas that led to the invasion of Panama, as well as sort of these accusations of like drug smuggling and stuff, and also just like general like terror in the streets, and Noriega being like a genuine dictator. Like there were, units of police going around like beating political opposition up, like newspapers were silenced. Like I just had an interview with La Prensa today. It's like their leading newspaper. and their office was like bombed 3 times in the 1980s. And the guy who set up the newspaper was excommunicated like several times, and it was a dictatorship. But what the book sort of argues and shows is how the United States, how and why they pick a foreign strongman, why and how they fund him and build him up, how they use him to sort of get what they want, which in this case, there were 2 things. It started out to stop the spread of communism and communist ideologies. And then secondly, it became to the drug trade, because the drug trade was just booming, and it just presented a lot of challenges for the US government. And Panama was so strategic, being like right in that point. Noriega was such a close ally that, it's that side of the story is like never really told. Like people kind of know about it, but it's like the US like really used this guy for like so long, and I'm publishing like hundreds of letters in the book from like the DEA and DOJ to Noriega, and like it's like gratitude for like decades. Like they're basically like, thank you so much, Mr. Noriega. Like, you really help. You're really doing us a solid. Like on paper at least, they like the guy, and they wanted to keep him around. So it's a complex story, and so I'll finish my sort of like little ramble here with this one statement that a very famous journalist. He's an American journalist, but he's lived in Panama for decades, and he used to do his work for Newsweek. But he said that the sort of history here, like Panama, the Iran-Contra affair, all of this web of intelligence, it's something that a lot of people know a little about, but nobody really knows everything. And partially that's because it's widely believed, and I believe it too after living here and meeting all these people, that Noriega died with the majority of his secrets. At the very least, he died with like the really revealing ones. And I'm not sure why. Nobody could tell me why.
Yeah, because he did. I mean, you mentioned earlier he was indicted. He did go to prison for a while.
He did.
Here, and then I think was extradited and went back to prison over there.
He died in prison. Yeah, he died in prison. He went to, first he was taken to Florida. Then the French wanted him, so he was extradited to France, to a prison just outside Paris, or I guess it's probably in Paris, but can't remember the name of it, but it's supposed to be like horrible prison. And he was there for a while, and then Panama wanted him back, so he came back here. He was at El Rana Ser, and then he died. He died after, I believe it was a botched surgery, but for like a brain tumor. I think it was a hemorrhage that ultimately killed him, but it was like a botched surgery that really like did him in. So yeah, he technically died in prison.
So I wonder what would somebody that has all that information, typically you would see, play out in real life in some cases, and definitely in motion pictures, where they're going to use that leverage to try to get some sort of leniency or something in lieu of the time, or something where they could be extradited back to their home country in a better prison, better surroundings, people they know, situations like that. Wonder what they could have threatened him with to not talk, to hold all those secrets. Because like you said, he had to know.
Yeah. Oh, of course. He absolutely knew. He knew so much, right? And because he really, like, I don't know if they ever like fully, truly trusted him, but he knew more than he should, and that was intentional. So Noriega becomes the chief of intelligence for Panama in the 1970s, right? He splits off the National Guard and creates G2, which is like an intelligence branch within the National Guard. He does this because he knows, and because he's seen and he's learned by knowing all these CIA guys and going to like a military school when he was young. And he was, by the way, he was like hand selected from this military school when he was a teenager. The CIA were like, we want to work with that guy. Like, he's bright, he's top of his class, he's a great soldier, he's loyal, whatever they said. I don't have to report. But Noriega knows in the 1970s that if Panama is going to be strong and they're not going to be like stomped on all the time, and basically, because a lot of countries are like, just sort of like doing whatever the US government says, the president or whoever at the time, it was, the CIA, they'd be like, we need this done, do it. And then if you don't do it, then, maybe the next time the threat is a little bit greater. Like, Noriega didn't really let it get to that point until the mid 1980s, but he strengthened the intelligence branch so much that he just sort of had cards to play, like whenever he needed them. So let's say like let's say like he does do this drug smuggling, he does benefit from this drug smuggling, and in the late 1970s, you know, the DEA and CIA are really catching on. They've got proof. And they're like, you know, Noriega, like you got to stop this. He could then play a card and be like, well, you know, if you want information about like Castro, then, you know, you're going to turn a blind eye. That's right. Just an example. I don't know if that really happened. That's what, you know, people sort of think that a lot of heads were turned, a lot of blind eyes. You know, the movie American Made, super like cinematic recreation of all this, but it's a good example and it's a relevant example. It's a movie that a lot of people have seen, but those pilots were CIA pilots. You know what I mean? Like they were recruited by the CIA to gather intelligence in Central America, parts of South America, and then they were just taken advantage of by the drug trade. You know, the two really overlapped during that period in the 1970s. So it's very super complex. It's amazing to talk about, but it's like I feel like every time I do, it's like opening up a box and all these bats fly out.
Yeah, you know? It's got a lot of different webs because in that movie, Tom Cruise portrays a American smuggler named Barry Seal that gets sort of sucked into where he's dealing with everybody. Mm-hmm. And he takes a plane that he knows is loaded with cameras and goes over there, and they essentially get video evidence of, you know, was it Pablo, right? They were loading drugs onto the plane.
Yeah, it was Pablo, and then, you know, it started off, they were getting intelligence from like about Nicaragua and Nicaragua with the Sandinistas.
Yeah. And so once he gets that, when they release those photos, when our government releases those photos, you've essentially ended this man's life because they know exactly, even if he's not responsible, he still brought the plane over there that let it happen. So essentially, you've given him a death sentence. But the compound on that, when Barry went to trial, they gave him time in a halfway house, which was part of his sentence. Mm-hmm. They announced in court where his halfway house is, the address, what time he had to be there by.
Man,
they essentially give anybody out there who may have wanted to take this man out, which by this time was half of that whole sector.
Yeah.
They gave the blueprint of how to take this fucking guy out. And it was a matter of time. They were waiting in the parking lot of the halfway house. When he showed up, they machine gunned him to death. And it's just like, those are types of things that wonder why people don't talk about it more. Because essentially our government had what we would classify as an asset assassinated without doing it ourselves.
Yeah, right. It's dude, I mean, that's a great way. That's a perfect example of what I was ultimately going to sort of state is that there's a whole lot of betrayal during this period. There are Americans being betrayed, like Barry Seal. There are Panamanians being betrayed, like, you know, I would argue that Carlos and a lot of Panamanian guys were betrayed, like these DEA assets, these intelligence assets in the 1980s who sort of did, obviously they benefited from it too. Like they made money, you know, I don't lose any sleep over thinking about how they lost out, but what they were was betrayed because their country was unjustly invaded, like unjustly invaded, all because of sort of these like boiling events, mostly to do with Noriega, but you know there were personal vendettas too, and you know Carlos, they were giving gratitude like at the time and whatever, and obviously that can't last forever. But come the mid 1980s, the late 1980s, particularly 1985, like Carlos is genuinely risking his life to transport weapons to the Contras in Nicaragua. You know what I mean? And he even said to me too, like while I was living with him, he was like, the Contras were animals. He was like, they were animalistic. He's like, we like the Sandinistas. It's like before the US approached Panama and like Noriega and stuff about helping out in Nicaragua, they used to train Sandinistas in Panama, you know? So they were essentially being asked to go against what they believed. And the turning point was in the mid 1980s when things were really dangerous. Noriega told the U.S. government, no, like we're not going to put our Panamanian troops in Nicaragua. We're not going to train Contras. He's like, we delivered them weapons, we delivered them money. Like that's all you're going to get. And then ever ever since then, between 85 and 89, or rather really 84 and 89, but 85 was when it started to get really bad. Sort of every year was just getting worse and worse for Noriega. In turn, he was acting worse and worse too. There were way more like political beatings, like all that sort of stuff. Domestically, this place was a fucking mess. But in terms of the relationship between the United States and Panama, it deteriorated. They just started to wheel back. They started to wheel back a little bit, and then 88 comes around and Noriega gets indicted, and then it's game over after that.
Well, that's long been said that, during the Reagan era and the Iran-Contra, they was trading drugs for weapons.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any discoveries of that in your book?
Not really. That stuff is actually pretty well documented.
Right.
There was I think the Iran-Contra affair became public knowledge when this photographer called Eugene Hassenfuss took a photo of a plane that was shot down in Nicaragua, and in the wreckage, I think the pilot might have survived or whatever, but in the wreckage, they realized that the plane was transporting, stuff to the Contras, and they were transporting weapons that had been bought by the United States because at the time there was a trade embargo, the Iran-Contra affair. So it was basically just like the government saying one thing to the public and then and Congress, and then doing something else behind their back. But what it really truly was an embarrassment for the U.S. government. It was an embarrassment for Reagan and George H.W. And Noriega became the biggest scapegoat of that for sure.
Yeah. They had egg on their face, essentially.
Totally had egg on their faces.
Was there any discoveries or talks in your book about Gary Webb or Danny Castellaros?
It's a sort of a comedic statement in the book that I said, I don't want to end up like Gary Webb for writing this shit. Because at time, like, I don't think I'm saying anything like insane in the book, but I'm presenting a new narrative, one that genuinely does contest the story that has been told by the U.S. government and the CIA and whatever. It's one that I just think it's a well-earned, like, refreshing take on the entire narrative, like, and it answers a lot of hows and whys as to what happened, because the plot doesn't change. Like, all the same stuff happens, but I wanted to make sure to present it through a different lens. Like, and to do that, I did it from the perspective of Noriega's right-hand man, who, of course, is biased. He's not going to tell me all the crappy, terrible things that he did on behalf of Noriega or that Noriega did himself, but I make sure to balance it. So while I've been in Panama, I've interviewed a lot of a lot of people, a lot of like spokes that jut out from this central argument. And that includes like American journalists, Panamanian journalists, authors, spies, Panamanian civilians, a lot of American soldiers, and then, people who worked on the canal during this time as well, and basically trying to round out the story as much as possible while telling it through Carlos's eyes. So there is that hint of bias, but I make sure every other chapter to write it from my perspective and say, even though Carlos told me this, you should know that this is what everyone else says, and this is what I could find. And it's very investigative in that regard. It's very journalistic, because I tell it's like basically the book is like one giant testimony, and then I am questioning that testimony as we work through the book, and I prove a lot of things that Carlos said because I hunted down a couple hundred documents that were previously classified. They were just like documented and kept from the Noriega days. They have been in the possession of this guy, Jose Hilario Trujillo. He was the former mayor of Panama City for quite some time. And I just met with him a bunch of times, and we negotiated the sort of handover of digital copies. So those documents are, just used to back up Carlos's story. And yeah, so I hope that sort of answers that.
Sure. And if anybody's not 100% on the people that I referenced earlier, there's a good documentary on Danny called The Octopus that you can go check out. And I think The Dark Alliance covers Gary's story. But essentially, it's just people that got too close and started uncovering information that people didn't want you to uncover. And I think back in those days, it was a lot easier to pull some of these things off. And then you had control of the media and could spin a narrative however you wanted. Nowadays, I think it's slightly harder, still possible, probably still being done. When you look at things like the Epstein files and what happened with Jeffrey Epstein, but it's just one of those cautionary tales where when people seek out the truth, sometimes you find it, and in some cases you even get killed for it. And obviously they're not gonna ever cop to this. Nobody ever say that, but you look at guys like Freeway Ricky Ross, he 100% believes our own government took some of those guys out.
Well, yeah, it's a genuine sort of I don't want to say it's a fear, but it's like a little thing that's in the back of your head when you're like writing about this kind of
Well,
stuff.
I think a lot of it now, like you said, is out. A lot of the facts are out. The narratives have been told from a couple different sides, but back then they were still trying to keep a lid on all this. So it was more of a slap in the face and a sin to expose it back then. They were trying to keep it hush hush if possible.
Oh yeah, the U.S. government's got a lot more to worry about right now than something that happened 40 years ago. Even though this sort of this book, this whole story it's a cycle. You know what I mean? Like this doesn't just pertain to Panama. It pertains to a lot of different sort of American-backed leaders that have come into power and been a ruthless dictator and then been ousted from power by another American coup that has been funded to like take them out. It's a vicious cycle, like Pinochet in Chile, even though he was right wing, a lot of these guys are left wing. But Pinochet in Chile, Pol Pot, Cambodia, even though that wasn't as much the US, like they were I redact that because that wasn't as much. But Pinochet, another Latin American leader, and then Noriega, of course, is like the big one here in this story in Panama. But Shah of Iran in Iran, and it's all over. Saddam Hussein,
yeah, Saddam Hussein for sure.
Yeah.
So, what is one of the biggest like contradictions of the narrative that was spun that was from Carlos claimed to be different?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the way that the narrative is currently spun, and I was surprised to learn this, but in the United States, when people think Noriega, they just think like they don't know that much about him. They think ruthless dictator, drug smuggler. They kind of put him in the same box as like Pablo Escobar. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like a Pablo Escobar who was like more involved in politics and more So that they think of that and they are valid in thinking it because that is like everything that the media has told them to think, especially like if you were watching the news every day back then, Noriega's name and face was just like smeared everywhere, like in every single newspaper that had sort of sections about world politics and whatever. Here in Panama, Noriega, if you even say Noriega's name in some rooms, like people will just start crying. They're like he was, especially to the poor, ruthless dictator. All that stuff is true. What has been previously been untold is just how deep the relationship really goes between Noriega and the US. Like, picture this: like Noriega's like a teenager in a military school. He is hand selected by the US government and the CIA as someone who's going to become a very important asset. Noriega starts to work for the US Army, the US Mapping Service. He then leaves that and joins the National Guard. Joins the National Guard, keeps all of his spy connections, all of his CIA intelligence connections. He is sort of, a lot of information is filtered through him and funding is filtered through him and given to this guy, Boris Martinez and Omar Torrijos, to lead a coup in Panama. And the CIA originally wanted Boris Martinez because he was like a right-leaning leader, but they ended up getting Omar Torrijos through basically like a really interesting series of events that I go through in the book. It's like a really cool chapter where Noriega is like smuggling Omar Torrijos like back into the country, and they're taking out this other Panamanian guy, Boris Martinez. But then, the 1970s come around, and Noriega just goes so deep with these relationships. He truly is like best friends with like Richard Helms. Like they met when they were young, but Helms becomes the director of the CIA. Noriega becomes the chief of intelligence for Panama, and he makes it a point to stay really close and to do as many favors as possible for the United States government. I say in the book, a direct quote is, when America needed their trash taken out in Latin America, whatever that meant, Noriega was the guy they called. Noriega has a story. In 1971, the CIA sent this guy, this Spanish guy, and I forget. They called him Comandante Villa. I'm not sure what his first name was, but Villa was his last name. And this Villa guy was sort of meant to go to Cuba, provide intelligence back to the CIA, and he was also meant to take out all of these guerrilla fighters under Castro. He ends up going to this fishing village and I guess open firing on the village and killing that where the guerrillas were hiding out, and kills a bunch of innocent people and all this sort of stuff. It's really hard to find information about this, but Noriega talks about it in his memoir, and Carlos told pretty much the exact same story for verbatim. And so Fidel Castro catches this guy Villa, and he throws him in jail, and he's going to execute him. And the CIA call Noriega, and they're like, "Hey, we need this guy back. You know, we can't go get him. Like, can you go get this guy, this literal mass murderer?" So Noriega, I assume, was like, "Well, you know, it's going to cost you, but I'm not sure how much or for what was exchanged." But either way, he goes to Cuba, he sits down with Castro, and he negotiates the handover of this mass murderer and gives him back to the Americans. And then ever since 1971, the relationship between Castro and Noriega is sort of like give and take like that. Like, you know, Noriega would give Castro like a lot of Panamanian passports so that Castro's spies could present themselves as Panamanians and come here to Panama and gather information from the American military bases that are on the Panama Canal and a lot of that sort of stuff. So, you know, it goes really deep, but Noriega in this story is just, it's very intentional. You know what I mean? Like he really just dug his claws in deep, and then when he ultimately becomes the dictator of Panama, he's so much more powerful than the United States sort of thought he was, and everybody thought he was, because he had strengthened all of these intelligence connections all over the world. So he just becomes like a genuine threat by the mid 1980s. I couldn't find like any proof that hasn't already been out there about money laundering and the drug smuggling and whatever. But, you know, he was brought to court over those charges, and very much used as a scapegoat in the global war on terror, you could say. But really it was the global war, the war on drugs, like Nancy Reagan's war on drugs, and Noriega just became the scapegoat, like the poster boy. You know, they like, why not go, like, I understand Noriega was really bad, like really terrible, like terrible dictator. This book is not pro Noriega, but why not just go directly to Colombia in 1988 or 1989 and clip the problem at its source? You know, Escobar, Ochoa, like those guys. It's like, no, I understand these things take time, and they ultimately did do that with the help of the Colombian army. But a lot of stuff to me just sort of seems like they'd made up their minds a long time before they invaded Panama, and a long time before they sort of gave the excuse of Noriega benefiting from this trade. You know, I really think it was the Iran-Contra affair and just being publicly embarrassed that sort of kicked everything off, and Noriega became like a scapegoat. But I'm not the only one who believes this. Like, this is something that I've seen people online say. Like, I don't call this book a revelation. I'm presenting a contrasting narrative that is just really strong with like primary, like firsthand testimonies, like primary sources. And then as well as that, like I personally came here and like lived with the guy and interviewed all these people myself. And I brought the recorder that I used, this little guy, for 2 years, and I just recorded everything. And I, when I was done, I filtered it through sort of some political figures here in Panama and historians, and I've really just refined it. So there are going to be people who are unhappy about this. Absolutely, I'm going to get contested on it, but this is considered a sort of a strongly investigated book that I tried not to have prejudice writing, where so much prejudice exists.
So I did have a question. You said that Noriega was kind of handpicked by the United States. If this is going to be our guy, what is the criteria, or how does someone get picked that early by the United States to be an asset for them?
It's a great question, and I wish I knew exactly like the criteria, but I think it all comes down to intelligence is a big thing. So you got to be incredibly smart. You know, you got to stand out in class. I think physically they would like soldiers. You know, they want soldiers who just excel. And then as well as that, they look for like personality traits that are compliant. You know what I mean? Like it's a lot easier to control someone who sort of just like says yes to everything that you do and goes and does it than somebody who's like a truly creative, truly like independent, like thought leader. And I think they want to mold people. They want to mold people's brains, and they want to use strong people who are ultimately going to end up in positions of influence. So, you know, I can't really speak to more than that because I know that Noriega was all of those things, but he was slightly, I believe, a tier above in the fact that he was deceptive in the way that he presented himself. So he presented himself as compliant when in fact, in the back of his head, he was just doing this to get what he wanted, which I, at the end of the day, believe was power and influence.
Was there anything that you uncovered that was sort of like things that have not been revealed?
Not necessarily. Like I said, it's really just like the main story as a whole, but there are little things in the book that, you know, I haven't really seen anywhere else, like from the earliest days of the 1970s when Omar Torrijos, the previous dictator to Noriega, when he was in power, he was a socialist, right? He was like a borderline communist. And the United States did not, like the CIA did not really want him in power, but he sort of gave them just enough to like stay in that position. And he was very charismatic and he was really well liked by like a lot of foreign leaders. And you know, he stayed in power for like 12 years. But but in the book, like this is kind of a revelation, but Omar Torrijos never wanted to communicate with the CIA. Like he chose not to out of spite because the CIA didn't want him there in the first place. And in 1969, they tried to essentially excommunicate him and remove him from any position of influence, but Torrijos came out on top, right? And so over the course of the 70s, they just tried to fuck with him. Like his younger brother's bodyguard was stopped at JFK Airport in New York with like carrying cocaine, and they tried to use that to pin it against Omar Torrijos and use it as leverage when Torrijos was like, you know, this guy was like a fucking like a bodyguard, you know, and there's a letter in the book where where essentially like the Department of Justice and the US government Department of Justice and US government are sending a letter to each other's representatives saying like, let's see how we can use this against Torrijos to sort of keep control. But that's, you know, it's a revelation for like this story and the plot line and the hows and the whys. But I say that, and I feel like the general public already knows this kind of stuff happens. You know what I mean? Like political leverage is everything. Like you'd be so naive to think that like world leaders today aren't, you know, using like leverage to like win. You know what I mean? Like a lot of it just comes down to winning.
100%, and still in use today. Totally. And I know this kind of came out after the fact, but I mean, what's working now is assumingly worked a long time before. Did you hear anything about the Panama Papers leak?
You know, I did, and I don't understand that like at all. One of the guys here was like, he brought it up, and he was basically just explaining to me like that, you know, money laundering and the banking system here is super dirty, and that it's still kind of a thing, but right up until the Panama Papers, it very much was a thing. What I can say is that the banking system here, none of this would exist without the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal generates so much wealth in this country that it's like a magnet, right? And everything is just like centered around. It's like gravity, you know. Everything's just like centered around it. And the banking system is a product of that. So the banking system was initially created as ways to both keep and launder money. You'd be naive to think that the Americans didn't benefit from that just as much as the cartels did, but the cartels very much did. And how it would work was they would have Panamanian citizens open bank accounts, and you know, they would just like filter the money through like that sort of patsy or whatever you call them. Like we can call them a patsy because they're just like a fall guy here in Panama. Everybody knew this was going on. But Americans totally benefited from this too. There were major corporations, I'm sure, in those Panama Papers. I've never read them. I don't really know that much about it, but it's been a problem in Panama for since the banking system was created. So,
yeah, their financial sector has always been widely known to help hide and launder drug money and facilitate drug buys and things like that. If I'm not mistaken, I'm assuming you've seen the movie Blow.
I have, yeah.
Wasn't when he and Carlos later, real name, I think it was Diego in the movie, but he was referred to Carlos later. I don't know why they didn't use his real name.
Yeah.
They go there and they essentially put all their money in there. He's like, I give you $50 million. You give me this little black book.
Yeah.
And then later on, that money was actually taken from him when he couldn't get it.
Yep. Yeah. I think, I'm not sure what year the Panama Papers was, but one of the guys was explaining to me just sort of how that can happen, right? How the money can be just like locked away and whatever. But I know that like under the Obama years, the IRS was,
I think it was 2016 when they said that leak.
Oh, really? Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not necessarily talking about the Panama Papers when I say this, but I'm sure it all relates. But somebody here told me that, Obama becomes president, 2008. He just like funds the IRS more, the Democrats, and that leads to more IRS agents. And a lot of IRS agents came down here to Panama because that money is being washed here, but it's still ultimately going to the United States, and people aren't paying taxes on it. And of course, the IRS is going to want to get their cheese, So I'm not surprised, but that also, if you really think about that, like Panama's not a U.S. state, it's not a colony, it's an independent nation. Why can the Internal Revenue Service, or it's Internal Revenue Service, right? Why can the Internal Revenue Service
go external?
Go external, you know what I mean? There's a lot of injustice, in my opinion. I'll use that word, even if there's like bullshit going on, like. Not saying any of this is the right thing to do, but at some point you got to sort of think like, okay, like Panama is an independent nation, but the U.S. is able to treat it as like essentially like a 51st state in so many ways. It's strange. And I'm not a Panamanian. I'm an Irish guy who lives in the U.S. Well, I was born in the U.S. I'm American and Irish, but I was raised in Ireland, and yeah, I have no stake in the game. I just think the history is incredibly interesting, and I just don't think like I've said before, I just don't think the correct story has been told.
No, it's very fascinating stuff. You remember was there a specific event that caused them to take those guys' money when that happened? Was there something that happened that caused them to take all that money?
In like the Panama Papers?
Well, no, not the Panama Papers, but in there, I forgot what led to them taking all of George's money in that movie. I don't know if there was an event that happened or something.
Well, I mean, the transactions are closely monitored. So, I'll say it, but I gotta like preface, I'm no expert on like economics.
That's Pablo even kept his money there also.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so people keep their money there, and then there's not much that there's not much people can do about like seeing the money in the bank accounts. Like there's a lot of privacy here, but what they can monitor is how the money moves. So they watch it like go through channels, and they can see like, where these like large quantities of money are being sent, and they investigate it like anything else, to my knowledge. So I know that back in the day in the 80s, they did this thing called layering, where basically like if they needed to send like $1 million or whatever to some guy in Germany, they would send $1 million to the guy in Germany, but they would also send like 9 other transactions, like random accounts all over the world, and sort of not like at the same time, but they would move the money through like, maybe 9 is too much. Like I said, I don't really know exactly, but they would layer it. So they would like move the same money through different accounts to make it harder to trace, and it would ultimately end up in the account that it needed to end up in. But it wasn't like a direct transaction, because if they did a direct transaction, then they could flag it a lot easier. And I presume in Blow, I haven't watched it in a few years, even though I love the movie. I presume in Blow they knew that George Jung was doing all this stuff. They had a close eye on him, and of course they had like their own spies in Colombia and whatnot. But when they realized that they could do this to George like they did. You know what I mean? Like it was time, because you also got to think like DEA, like CIA, all these guys, like it's a job for a lot of people, and they're just being paid to investigate what is most pressing at that moment in time. So George Jones, you know, at that, like there were many George Jones. You know, I know of this one story. This guy Alex DeCubas in Miami, and it's a really cool story. ESPN did like a 30 for 30 on it, because the story is like Alex DeCubas was like this drug smuggler for Escobar, but he was being hunted down by the DEA, and one of the members of the DEA was like his wrestling buddy from high school. He was like his best friend in high school. So it's an awesome story, but Alex DeCubas was kind of like a George Jung. He did the exact same things, where George flew a lot of it to California. You know, DeCubas was one of the like Florida guys. So you got to think about it like agents just sort of like being told what to do, like going after like the web, of course, but it's like these guys are like knocked down one by one. You can't beat those agencies. You know what I mean? Like it's impossible. Right. You know, so you're fucked like right from the get-go. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. You know?
Yeah, and we've interviewed a lot of people that's you know, just done a lot of work over there with you know, different types of product, if you will. I don't want to get this video disbanded, but some even come pretty close to hanging with or did in fact hang with Noriega, specifically a guy that he's a marijuana smuggler, and he said he never wanted to graduate, you know, to the white stuff because there was a lot more danger. He said, man, I was basically bringing them party favors. He was like, why would you want to take me out? You know, he's like, what I'm doing is peanuts. He said, but it's still a lot of money to be made. He's like, but you start talking about, you know, dealing with the other stuff. He's like, they just assume kill you and take the load and then find the next guy that's going to take your spot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's really cool. That's interesting. See, it's like testimonies like that you hear about Noriega that would make it like totally naive to assume that he never was involved in that kind of shit. You know what I mean? Like you right there have like a first-hand account of a smuggler hanging out with Noriega. So it's really interesting overall, and a lot of people benefit from this. But you're right, it was a tiered system. It's like the baddest guys, the baddest guys in their eyes were the ones making the most money, right? Making the most money, and then you got guys like your buddy who were, you know, peanuts. But even though those peanut guys did get though they did get in trouble, like Noriega would still hand over smugglers to the DEA, and I've got like the documentation that's in the book to prove it. You know, there's names explicitly said in these documents, and they're like, you know, I'll give a false name, but like Roberto Sanchez, like caught with 100 pounds of marijuana at this port in Panama, like he claims he was like transporting it to the Dominican Republic. You know what I mean? And it's like they the problem was just like so big that this thing was created, Operation Tigray, in 1979, and it was like the US put it together. Noriega was one of the big influences in it too, but they basically got all the Latin American countries to like get together, and all of their agents were tasked with like hunting down these drug smugglers. So and also last statement with regard to that, even though it is naive to ever think that like, you know, that people didn't benefit from this stuff at that level. It's an interesting fact that after the U.S. invasion of Panama, and after Noriega was taken to Florida, that was in 1989, the very start of 1990, drug smuggling doubled the year later. So it doubled from South America to the US through Panama. So regardless of what Noriega may likely personally benefited from, he really did keep a strong hold on that sort of illicit drug trade coming from Latin America. Like he really did pour a lot of Panama's resources into that, of course funded by the US, but he poured a lot of like time, money, lives on the line of Panamanians to stop that drug trade.
Right. We'll wrap up with a couple more questions. I want to ask some names to see if you'd heard anything about, because some of these people played some key roles on the American side of things. And if you didn't hear anybody that did pop up, you know, in regards to them being American, did you hear anything about Oliver North?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So Oliver North and John Poindexter.
Yeah, that was the next guy I was going to ask you about.
Yep, both them two, and then there was another guy called Richard Secord. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, but they were CIA Well, no, they were national security guys, but worked with the CIA, like all this sort of stuff. But anyway, they were tasked.
And William Casey, I think he was the director.
And Casey, Casey was the director, at the time. Yep. And Noriega actually claimed that him and Casey were tight. William Casey actually died before the invasion of Panama, and Noriega said in his memoir, which is really just a transcript between a journalist by the name of Peter Eisner and interviewing Noriega, but he said that if William Casey was still alive during his trial, then he would have like defended him on the stand. And I thought that was pretty interesting. Oh, sorry, he died in 1987. But either way, before the U.S. invasion. But I thought that was pretty interesting. He claimed that him and Casey were super tight, essentially. But Oliver North, John Poindexter, they are in the story. This stuff has been documented before, but I definitely put a little bit more emphasis on it. They come to Panama in, I was told 1984. Some people say 1985, but they come to Panama. They meet with Noriega, and they ask Noriega to train the Contras in Nicaragua. At that point, Carlos had told me that they were transporting weapons and money to the Contras in Nicaragua, but they were refusing to train them because Carlos said just because they didn't like them, because they were animalistic, they didn't trust them, and they also liked the Sandinistas. They liked Daniel Ortega, like the socialist, and so Poindexter and those guys, Richard Secord, when he came down, they were told no, right? And then it was their responsibility. Like they were just given the task of dealing with Iran, dealing with the Sandinistas and the Contras with that war in Nicaragua. They wanted Panama's help. Noriega said no. That plane is shot down, I think, in 1986. Eugene Hassenfuss takes that photo. I think it was the Miami Herald that published that photo for the first time. North and Poindexter have egg on their face. They're obviously put on trial for going against like the Congress and the American government. But I think, talk about like naivety, I think it would be naive to assume that Reagan and Bush didn't know about that. George H.W. was the director of the CIA for a long time. He was super involved in U.S. intelligence. Because he knew how important it was, So I think it's foolish to believe that those guys were just coming here on their own free will to try get weapons to the Contras and during a trade embargo. Like it doesn't really make sense. And I'm obviously not the first guy to say that. It's pretty well documented that they got in trouble for it. They should have gotten more trouble, but they got in trouble for it. And
their convictions, I think, wound up getting overturned anyway. Reagan was never indicted. Bush was never indicted.
No,
Dexter and North were indicted, and then they got their convictions overturned. I think it was some issues due to their initial testimony or immunized testimony. I think is what it was.
Yep, and because HW became president, and so all this stuff happened so long ago that like what's going to happen, but it's sort of like you look at it now and you're just like, man, like all of this shit just happened like right under the American public's nose, and it was so deceptive. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's deception. That's for the American public, it's deception. For the Panamanians, it's betrayal, right? That's what I argue anyway. People are gonna contest the shit out of me for doing this, but you know what? I just this is just what I genuinely believe. I would really encourage anyone who thinks I'm like pulling this shit out of my ass to just like read the book and review the documents that will be published when the book comes out on November 4th.
Now, when you said Carlos couldn't get back into the country, he left to go get his daughter. He's seeing the fall of Noriega. Was that essentially the end of the things that he did, or would
no?
I don't really know if there's retirement in that life.
Yeah, no. So I don't put that much focus on it because like Noriega's in prison and Noriega's like a huge focal point in the book. But Carlos, he decides to face Interpol head on, face the charges. He dips in and out of prison in various countries for a couple of years. I know he spent 6 months in a terrible prison in Peru. I can't remember the name, but he faces his like fines head on. He sort of does all that. He ends up getting away getting away from it like scot-free, relatively, right?
Really?
Panama changes a lot in the 1990s, not under a dictatorship anymore. American troops leave the Panama Canal uh, in the year 2000. The Panama Canal goes back into Panamanians' hands. The country, I guess, feels very different to how it did just 10 years prior. Noriega gets extradited to Paris from Florida, and Carlos actually moves to Paris so that he could visit him in prison every day. So Carlos picked up a job in a restaurant as like a busboy, and he worked as like a busboy for pretty much the full amount of time that Noriega was in prison in Paris, so that he could pay rent. And then when he wasn't working, he would go to the prison, and if he was allowed to meet with Noriega. So he the story, like, between their relationship, it ends in a relatively touching way. You know, he sort of is so loyal to Noriega, so loyal to his like best friend in the world, that even though he's in prison, fucking 5,000 miles away from France, whatever that is, from Panama, you know, he makes that journey. He goes there. He sets up a life there for as long as he needs to, and then Noriega gets extradited back to Panama. Carlos moves back to Panama. Basically, spends the rest of Noriega's life like visiting him in prison and stuff like that, like being by his side. So the loyalty never dies. And you know, sadly, Carlos passed away this past March. So this this testimony, this book, you could argue it was like on his deathbed. He told me things that he probably kept in for a long time. His own children did say to me that he definitely didn't tell me everything. Like, I'm sure there were some bad things in there, some atrocities that he was partially responsible for, maybe directly, but either way, there were definitely things he didn't want me to know. But that being said, that's why I like rounded it out with the other stuff and whatever. But yeah.
Well, that's good you did that too. That has a lot more credibility, because I always tell people, like, when you watch documentaries and things like that, and I'm real big into like wrongful convictions and things like that, whoever's controlling the documentary, you're going to see their side of it more than you will the other, you know, because that's
totally,
they're controlling the documentary. So if I'm putting on a documentary of how I'm innocent, you're going to see way more points of me being innocent than anything even remotely related to guilt, because I'm doing it.
Totally, dude. That's why, you know, obviously, you know, the system quite well. That's why like a really good like sentencing memo or like a narrative in court is so strong, because the judge and the jury, they only see you like as this figure on a piece of paper, like you're almost not even human. But if you can find a way to tell your story, then you just infinitely become more human. And there's two sides to every story, right? Two sides to every coin. That's that's something that, you know, people have said before, obviously, but it's something I truly believe. And with the story that everybody knows about Noriega being this, you know, this story that the world has been told for 40 years, like, I'm just presenting another story here that I think is incredibly strong, filled with like super strong testimonies, and a lot of research and a lot of investigation, and yeah.
Thank you for coming on and sharing this with us. Very cool insight, very cool subject matter. And we only scratched the surface in this. I mean, like you said, there's so many webs and vines that go all over the place when you start digging in to this whole thing. You could spend hours and hours and days and months digging into all the things that it connects to, because one thing connects here and then that connects there. And I mean, you're all over the place. So I appreciate you putting in the legwork and then coming on this show and telling us about it. When is this book dropping?
It's dropping November 4th.
November 4th. And I'm assuming this is going to be available everywhere: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books and Me, and things like that.
All of the above. Yeah. Amazon is probably the easiest to get if you're in the US.
Definitely. So we'll put out some clips from this interview, and then when it drops, we'll kind of do a little resurgence, let everybody know the book is out and book is available. Last question of the night. It's actually got nothing related to your book. How did you find me? Just out of curiosity.
I'm going on Matthew Cox's podcast in Tampa.
Oh, okay.
In a week, and I've been firing out emails to anybody like in this world, and I watched a little bit of your conversation with him. You've spoken with him multiple times, right?
Oh yeah, I've been on his show quite a bit. Yeah.
I definitely watched the clips from two different episodes, and I reached out. I saw that I could access your email, pretty publicly, and I just
Yeah.
reached out. But I'll tell Matt that we had this because I haven't told him yet.
Oh, okay.
I'm doing his podcast 1 week from today, and I'm doing the Danny Jones podcast in Tampa as well.
Oh, yeah. I think he's in Clearwater if he didn't change.
He is, yeah. He's in Seminole, I think it is. Yeah. But I'm literally flying there this week.
That's crazy. I was actually going to text Matt when I got done and tell him I got a guy that's got a good story. So you're flying back home, or are you doing this remote?
No. I was originally going to leave Panama anyway at the end of the month, and my flight was through Florida, and I don't really have a home, by the way. I'm like a traveling rider. I don't have an apartment or anything like that. I've got a girlfriend in Boston, and and a couple of my family members are there. So I spend quite a bit of time there, but I travel to Ireland and California and stuff, and mostly Panama. I just spent like months living in Mexico and a little bit in Italy, and I just go everywhere, dude. So I was gonna be in Florida. I really like Matt's podcast, Inside True Crime. And so I reached out to him. He got back to me super quickly. We spoke on the phone. He was like, yeah, dude. He's like, can you come to Florida? I only do in-person interviews. And my connecting flight was actually through Florida. So second half is fucked. I'm just staying. And then he was like, you should speak. Do you know who Danny Jones is? You should speak with him. I did know who Danny Jones was. I was a fan, and I'd already reached out to him. But
I've been on the show as well.
Yep, and Matt just gave me the introduction, and thankfully I'm able to do both within like a 3-4 day window of each other. So yeah, I know that's a super long-winded answer to your question, cool. But I'm excited, dude.
Yeah, well, you got a great story, man. I know you'll have a blast with those guys. They're very good at what they do. And again, I appreciate you coming on. When this thing drops, we'll put some clips up, letting everybody know this is available to the public. And Cillian, I really appreciate you coming on the show, my friend.
Wade, I appreciate it so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, my friend. Ladies and gentlemen, that'll do it for this episode of Crime and Entertainment. We'll see you next week.